So currently in my scene, I have created a plane that is at a scale of 50 by 50 on the Z and the X axes. I've inserted a cube, which will later become something that we can collide with. And I have created just a simple maze by using cubes and creating those into walls and placing them around the scene. So in this tutorial, we're going to create a small player. I'm going to use a sphere, and that sphere is going to be able to move around this maze. In the next tutorial, we'll then have the sphere collide with this cube so that it collects it. So as a little tip up here in our hierarchy window, I now have this plane and all of these sort of walls. It can start to look a little bit messy, and essentially they're all one thing. So if I move my plane, I would like all of my walls to be able to move with it. It's like a game board. I want to be able to move the whole thing at once. So if I click on wall 1 and shift click on wall 8, I can actually drag those and child them to my plane. So now I can actually open that up and still edit them individually if I need to, but I can also just name this maze. Oops. And if I select it and move it, the whole maze will actually move, walls and all. So it makes it a little bit easier to deal with. Put that position back to 0. Okay, so now we're going to insert our sphere, which is going to be our player. So I can create a 3D object and choose sphere. And the sphere appears in our scene. If for some reason you can't see your sphere, you can double click on it. That'll bring your camera to your sphere, and you can check the position of the sphere in your transform toolbar. And we can set all of those back to 0 until we get the sphere exactly where we want it. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need our sphere to actually have a rigid body on it. This is because we want it to adhere to physics. So when the game starts, we want it to sort of fall to the ground. When the person is playing with it, if they get a bit of speed up, we want the ball to have some momentum and sort of continue rolling or slow down when the person tries to stop rather than stopping automatically. So the way that we can do that is to add a component in our inspector by choosing Add Component. And we can go to Physics, Rigid Body. Now that has added simple physics to our sphere. Alright, so the next thing we do after adding the rigid body is to write a script that will then control this player. So coming down to our Assets window, our Assets folder in the Project window, I'm just going to click on our Scripts folder. I have some scripts in here from previous tutorials, but essentially we're just going to right click and choose Create C#. I'm going to call this player controller, and then we open it up. Okay, so we need to also double check that our player controller public class is the same as what we've named our script, so it won't accept any spaces. So if you do have spaces in your script name, that will cause issues. So just always double checking that those two are the same before we start. We're then going to include a couple of variables. So the first variable that we would like to include is the speed of our player. So we're going to create a public float. So public meaning that we're going to be able to see it in the inspector and reference it from other scripts. Float meaning that this will be allowed to be a decimal value. We're going to call it speed, and we'll place a semicolon. At the moment, I haven't given the speed, I haven't given the variable a value, the speed of value. We will set that in the hierarchy later, in the inspector later. This will allow us then to have a bit of a trial and error to decide what speed we actually want the player to go at before we set it in the script. The second variable that we're going to use in this script is actually referencing the rigid body component that is on our player. So this is going to be a private variable, and the variable type itself is rigid body. And we're just going to call it RB. So the value for this rigid body we're actually going to set in the start function. So when the game first initializes, it will find that component that is connected to our sphere and it will add that into this variable called rigid body. So the way that we do that is we say RB equals, and now we can set a value. Get component rigid body. So the first thing that we're going to do with our update function is actually change it to be a fixed update function. So the update function will work, but this function is called at irregular intervals. So the update function is called over and over and over again, but it's not called at a regular time frame. It's called every frame. But if one frame happens to be longer than another, then the intervals between that function running are different. Fixed update is called on a regular timeline and it'll have the same amount of time between calls. So this makes the physics of our object more accurate. So fixed update is really handy when we're using a player controller or something where the user is actually having input, because it's going to make that input more consistent. So the first thing we're going to do here is create another variable, a float, which is called move horizontal. And that float is actually going to equal an input by the user along the horizontal axis. So input get axis means that it's waiting for the user's input, and horizontal is a keyword within Unity that it understands to be the left and right arrow keys or the AD keys on the keyboard. We're going to repeat this, but this time we're going to say move vertical, and the input dot get axes that we're expecting will be the vertical axes, or the up down arrows. Make sure we're spelling that correctly. Vertical with a semicolon. So this time float move horizontal will be whether the person is hitting the left or right arrow. Float move vertical will equal whether the person is hitting the up or the down arrow. We're then going to create another variable, and this time this variable is a position in the 3D space, and we're going to call that movement. So the vector3 movement is equal to a new vector3, which is whatever the move horizontal variable is equaling on the x-axis. We're going to create 0 on the y-axis because we don't at this point want it to be able to move up or down, just forward and back and left and right. So the x-axis will be whatever this move horizontal input is. The y-axis will just be set to 0, and the z-axis will be whatever the input for vertical is, which is move vertical. Okay, so now we have all of our variables set up, but we don't actually have a script doing anything yet. So now we need to add the piece of script that's actually going to move our player. So what we can do here is say RB, which is our rigid body variable, AddForce, movement times speed. So now it's saying collect this rigid body variable, add a force to it, and that force is going to equal whatever our movement is, move horizontal, move vertical, times whatever our speed is set to. So this is a really simple script that's just going to be able to move an object forwards and backwards, left and right at a particular speed that is set in the inspector. So let's save that. Okay, so now that we're back in Unity, I can add my player controller script, onto my player, which is my sphere. I'm just going to change the name of my sphere in the hierarchy to player. It's easier to do this as you go along, making things sort of have logical names rather than trying to come back later when you may have, 50, 60 or more objects in your hierarchy. I'm going to grab our player controller script and drop it onto our player. I can see now when I click on my player on the inspector, I can see my script here, player controller script, and the speed at the moment is set to 0. So I might just try setting that speed to 5, and I'll press play and check whether or not this is working. So you see when I press forward on my keyboard, my sphere goes forward. When I remove my hand, it still slowly rolls because it has that momentum of the rigid body on it. When I click back, it gathers speed. If I press to the right or to the left, it should move in that direction at that particular speed. So I quite like the speed that I have here. I think 5's working quite well, depending obviously on the size of your maze, the size of your sphere, and what you actually want this sphere to be doing. That can be something that you can have a bit of a play with. But for now, I'm just going to go into my player controller script. And I'm going to set that speed to 5 so that every time this game starts up now, 5 is the default speed. And that is how we insert a keyboard controlled player into our scene.